Welcome! We are continuing to explore the book of Daniel. In our last 26 videos, we have been exploring verses 3 to 39, which all perfectly aligns with history. But we're now going to consider verses 40 to 45, which do not at all align with history. Verses 40 to 45 are historically inaccurate. For instance, Daniel is going to tell us there will be a 7th Syrian war, which never happens, and that Antiochus will die in Israel, which again doesn't happen. So the obvious question is, why is Daniel all of a sudden making mistakes? Well, the only reasonable conclusion is that the author of Daniel was writing between these two sections. Therefore, the reason why verses 3 to 39 are historically accurate is because Daniel is simply recording past events. But then, for verses 40 to 45, Daniel attempts to actually predict the future, but is inaccurate in doing so. Writing on this, Atkinson writes the following, quote, "These predictions on the activity of Antiochus Epiphanes are accurate right up to the point that they cease being historical statements and become real predictions. Then they go awry, and that is the point of deviation which permits the dating of the book," end quote. And this is why scholars are so certain that Daniel wrote in about 165 BC. And dating a biblical book so precisely is really quite unique, as the author continues to write, quote, "The book of Daniel is more tightly dated than any item in either the Jewish or Christian scriptures." Likewise, Metzger writes, quote, "The book of Daniel is one of the few books in the Bible that can be dated with precision," end quote. Okay, now it's time to compare Daniel's inaccurate timeline with the historically accurate timeline. Based on our historical sources, we know that Antiochus didn't invade Egypt for the 7th time. Rather, in 165 BC, he has an eastern campaign in Persia. Then, Antiochus doesn't die in Israel. Rather, in 164, he dies in the east. And finally, while Daniel doesn't mention this, the temple is purified by the Maccabees in 164 BC, the same year as Antiochus's death. Newsom writes in her commentary, quote, "Since the author of Daniel 11 does not seem to know about Antiochus's actual campaign in the east in late 165, the rededication of the temple by Judah the Maccabee in December of 164, or the death of Antiochus in Elam about that same time, it seems that the author of Daniel wrote his prophecy sometime before those events," end quote. Likewise, in the Yale Anchor commentary, we read the following, quote, "The author must have composed his apocalypse before the campaign of Antiochus IV Epiphanes in the east, in the summer of 165, for instead of predicting this, he foretold of a successful campaign of the Syrian king in Egypt for this year, a campaign that never actually took place," end quote. Okay, what we're now going to do is break down these actual historical events. But before doing so, I'm going to thank my patrons and YouTube members that make these videos possible. The goal of this channel is to create a library of videos that objectively analyze the Bible. If that's something you think is important, please consider becoming a member today. If you become a member, you'll get access to my full videos, so please consider it. Okay, back to the content now. Now, before we break down these 3 historical events, let's just take a step back. And we're going to begin by describing the 6th Syrian War. This is when Antiochus goes to invade Egypt, but Rome sends a man by the name of Pompilius to stop him. And we have the famous day of Ulysses, in which Antiochus is humiliated by Rome. He loses all his territorial gains in Egypt and is forced to retreat home. Now, the next major event in the life of Antiochus is known as the Procession of Daphne. This was a military parade in Daphne, which is near Antioch, where he showed off all the spoils of the 6th Syrian War. Here is a painting of such a military procession. So what kings used to do after a successful conquest is they would parade all the bounty of war through the streets to show it off to all of their subjects. And the king himself would be a part of this procession. Now, the image before you is a painting known as the Triumph of Aemilius Paulus, the Roman general who defeated the Macedonians at the Battle of Pydea in 168 BC, but it gives you a sense of what the procession of Daphne would have looked like. Antiochus IV would have been showing off all the gains of the Sixth Syrian War during his procession of Daphne. Writing on this event, Guerra writes the following, quote, 2 years after the day of Ulysses, in the summer of 166, Antiochus Epiphanes made a point of demonstrating his gains from the war against the Ptolemaic kingdom. Daphne was to become the focus of interest for visitors from afar. A procession was to be formed in this suburb of Antioch, and games and gladiatorial contests were to be held. The riches amassed by Antiochus Epiphanes during his Egyptian campaign were also presented in the non-military part of the procession, in which objects made of gold and silver were lavishly displayed. End quote. If you want to read the original sources describing this event, check out Diodorus, book 31, and Polybius, book 30. Okay, let's now move on to our next event, which occurs in 165, and it's when Antiochus begins his eastern campaign. Let's bring up a map to really help us out here. So in 165, a king in the east, known as Artaxerxes, revolts against the Seleucid rule. We read this in Diodorus, who immediately after describes... Are you enjoying this video so far? Do you want to watch the rest of it? Well, the only way for you to do that is to become a patron. The full video is only available to patrons. So click the link in the description below and become a patron today.